Ormund Hightower basically came out of nowhere and managed to flip the script of the Dance of the Dragons in a surprisingly limited amount of moves. But House of the Dragon didn't explain exactly why what he did seemingly ensured that the Civil War would keep going. One of the fundamental pieces of lore that the TV series hasn't really explored is the role that House Hightower plays in Westeros, and the ways in which they contrast with House Targaryen. Obviously, the Targaryens came into the Seven Kingdoms hot and fast. They were unequivocally the most martially powerful house on the continent, and they built a dynasty off of that power. But relatively speaking, they also flamed out very quickly as well. In an area where many families hold some kind of power for 1,000 years or more, the Targaryens didn't even make it to 300. House Hightower's story is pretty much the exact opposite. They have been the lords of Old Town, the oldest, and for most of its history, largest city in Westeros, for so long that historians aren't even sure when their reign began. Regardless of that, though, they have been in a position of enormous power essentially since humans existed on the continent. They're also a pretty direct contrast to House Targaryen, because the Targaryens took control of Westeros using the hardest of hard power. They literally overtook everything through military force, and they were without question the center of Westerosi politics when they conquered the continent. The Hightowers have built and maintained their power using a drastically different strategy. They do have a significant martial force in comparison to every non-Targaryen family in Westeros, but more importantly, they have ingratiated themselves into every arena of soft power over millennia. Because of their location, which was the hub of Westeros for most of human history, they exerted a lot of influence over the culture, economics, education, religion, and politics of the continent. But a key component of that power was that they rarely flaunted it or tried to be the stars of the show. In fact, the so-called leaders of the Reach have pretty much always been a family that is not the Hightowers, even though their seat was objectively more powerful than someplace like Highgarden. Otto Hightower himself is a pretty apt representation for how House Hightower has operated since its inception. Viserys was the front-facing image of power sitting on the Iron Throne and representing House Targaryen. But Otto occupied the second most powerful position and exerted a great deal of control over the political movements of the Seven Kingdoms. Playing second fiddle has been a strategy that worked well for House Hightower for thousands of years, which makes Ormund Hightower's actions after Rhaenyra took King's Landing a bit of an aberration. However, his decision to swap out Daeron with a fake and overtake Tumbleton are off-brand in some ways but quite predictable in others. Firstly, House of the Dragon hasn't really elaborated on why Tumbleton is relevant to the war overall, and at this point in particular. The series is obviously setting it up to be a point of conflict for Hugh Hammer specifically, but it's important for more than just dramatic purposes. As the Hugh Hammer side plot subtextually indicates, Tumbleton is a town that's a stone's throw away from King's Landing, so it's a natural place for a lot of people in King's Landing to go when there's some kind of upheaval. It's also a market town that sits at the top of the Mander River, one of the central pathways through the Reach that goes almost all the way to King's Landing. Now, taking Tumbleton has a few different tactical components to it. While it's not the only route from the Reach to King's Landing, it is one of the major supply lines from the farming center of Westeros to the capital. More importantly, as House of the Dragon directly addressed, it's not the kind of place that anyone would want to just attack with dragons to break the siege. It's a highly populated area, so the collateral damage would be significant. And under normal circumstances, Tumbleton alone likely wouldn't be enough to cause a crisis in King's Landing. But Ormund Hightower is essentially flipping the script on the blockade that the Blacks were using to create a crisis for the Greens, and is now making it into Rhaenyra's problem because she is now on the throne. Because they were already in dire straits, it doesn't take a lot for the Hightowers to push the Blacks to the breaking point. So strategically, this is a pretty solid move. But of course it begs the question of why Ormund Hightower decided to do this when it's overall a much riskier move than House Hightower would normally go for. Especially since it would appear the Greens have basically lost the Dance of the Dragons anyway. And the most likely answer is Daeron. With Otto dead, Aegon missing, Aemond in the Riverlands, and Alicent, Helena, and Jaehaera in King's Landing, Daeron is the only ace in the hole that House Hightower has left in hand. It's entirely possible that Ormund didn't want to hand him over because he actually does care, as Daeron spent most of his life being raised in Old Town. But giving up his only dragon rider and a claimant to the throne, especially to someone like the Rogue Prince, is a more than sketchy proposition. Daemon pretty much instantly demonstrates why Ormund wouldn't want to surrender Daeron as a hostage. Because there's a very high likelihood that he would have been killed to cement Rhaenyra's claim. But considering the chaos of recent months, it's even more understandable why Ormund would hold on to Daeron. The line of succession has been changing radically in the last few weeks alone, and claimants to the Iron Throne have been dropping like flies. In normal circumstances, expecting half a dozen royals to die would be quite a long shot. But Rhaenyra has already lost 2 of her heirs, or if we're going by Fire and Blood canon, she is believed to have lost 3 children by this time. So if things keep going in the direction that they are, it could be a near guarantee that one of the Hightower Targaryens ends up on the Iron Throne through completely legitimate and uncontested means. If Rhaenyra and her children are dead, then Viserys' remaining children are legally the next in line according to pretty much everyone, regardless of who took whose side at the start. Obviously, the status of Aegon and Aemond is a bit of a mystery at this point, but Daeron taking the Iron Throne would have ultimately been the best case scenario for House Hightower, as he is the most Hightower of the Targaryens already. So, even though taking the lead against the Blacks was a much bolder move than the Hightowers would typically make, the potential payoff for Ormund and the entire house may have justified that risk. Clearly, Ormund was aware of the possibility that Daeron would be taken hostage, as he had a fake in hand and ready to hand over to Daemon when they had their little confab. But it's an interesting scenario, because Daemon demanding Daeron essentially forced Ormund to take a stand. And I'd be curious to know how things would have worked out had Daemon not taken Daeron hostage. Because once fake Daeron was gone, Ormund had to assume that the random teenager he thrust into the middle of a civil war wasn't going to be able to uphold the ruse for very long, which is probably why he immediately seized Tumbleton. At that point, the plan was just to fob off the Blacks for a long enough time to allow his army to get a foothold somewhere important. So once anyone realized he'd swapped a fake Daeron for the real one, he'd already be in the position he wanted to be in. But if Daemon hadn't asked for Daeron, I'm not sure that Ormund would have made such an aggressive move. Obviously, Daeron is arguably the biggest threat left on the Green team aside from Aemond, so taking him was always going to be one of the primary goals for the Blacks. But had Ormund actually acquiesced to Daemon's demand, then he would have to simply hope that the Blacks keep to their word and allow him to live. There was no easy solution for the current Lord Hightower, but it's not surprising that he didn't bet his life on Daemon and Rhaenyra either. Continuing the Dance of the Dragons when you have one relatively small dragon on your team, and when many members of your extended family have been captured or killed already, is definitely a bit of a Hail Mary, but it may have beaten the alternative. And realistically, the easiest way to destabilize Rhaenyra's reign was likely to never let her stabilize to begin with. Despite it being the Dance of the Dragons, it's interesting to see how much non-dragon power has been influencing the events as they've unfolded. It's also interesting that the Blacks seemingly take their victory as a given at this point, as it seems especially strange that no one questioned whether or not Ormund was truly handing over his most valuable player as soon as Daemon asked for him. However, considering that Ormund already went all in on fighting alongside his branch of the Targaryen family, it's possible he assumed, understandably so, that there was no going back and he might as well go down swinging. And given his present circumstances, they were some pretty solid swings. But what do you think? Would Ormund have done what he did if Daemon hadn't taken fake Daeron? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.